Hey, everybody, welcome back for another edition of Ask Chuck Dixon, Chapter 37. The saga continues. Um, this is where I answer questions about what it is that I do for a living, and what I do for a living is I write comic books. And if you have questions for me, if you'd like to see your question appear in a segment of Ask Chuck Dixon, see your name on the internet, how exciting is that? You can send your questions, statements, comments, complaints directly to brunobookstore@gmail.com. That is the most direct way to reach this video channel. You can also find me on Facebook, and you can also just simply leave a comment at the bottom of the page right under this video, obviously. And I look at all of them all the time. Let's get to our first question. David Jordan says, I've been reading El Cazador and enjoying it a lot, and wondered if you could give me a top 10 or top 5 of your favorite swashbuckler movies. Doesn't necessarily need to be pirates. El Cazador, in case you don't know, was a series I did for CrossGen, the most successful comic book CrossGen ever published, which unfortunately came too late to save the company. The first 6 issues were collected into a trade paperback by Hyperion Publishing. Story by me, absolutely gorgeous artwork by Steve Epting. If you can't find a copy, let me know at brunobookstore.com and I'll see if I can hook you up. Yeah, great swashbuckler movies. Love a good sword fighting movie. One of my favorites is Scaramouche. It's a 1950s, it might have been a remake of a silent film, but it's based on a Raphael Sabatini novel, and Stuart Granger plays a guy who's seeking revenge on a evil sociopathic aristocrat played by Mel Ferrer. And Stuart Granger has to go into hiding. He goes into hiding with a company of actors, traveling company of actors, and he takes on the role of Scaramouche, a masked clown-like character, so that he can basically move through French society without being seen. The most awesome thing about this movie is the incredible extended sword fight sequence through a crowded opera house. And it's just shot in wonderful MGM splendor. It's just a terrific sword swinging movie. Another big favorite of mine is Richard Lester's adaptation of The Three Musketeers, done as 2 separate films in the 1970s. A great cast, great atmosphere, and the sword fights are not the traditional classic theatrical sword fights that we were all used to seeing, the sort of mannered duels with epées and sabers. Um, Lester shot these scenes, and they were choreographed in such a way as probably be a lot more realistic and a lot more violent sword fights than we were used to seeing. And lots of punching and kicking and throwing things, and great uses of locales. I think the secret to a great sword fight is where it takes place. I'll talk a little bit more about that. A recent one, this was done in the 90s, a French film. Daniel Attell is, a sword fighting dude who serves as protector for this young girl. And being a French film, it ends in a very French way. But there's some fabulous sword fights in it. A real throwback film. Another great French film is it's sometimes called The Fifth Musketeer. It's sometimes called The Daughter of D'Artagnan. But it stars Sophie Marceau as the daughter of D'Artagnan, and the Musketeers appear in it. And they're much older now, and it's another good one, another good throwback sword fighting flick with an awesome sword fight on the rooftop of a castle to close out the movie. Just terrific. Mark of Zorro, Tyrone Power, features one of the best sword fights ever put on film. He battles Basil Rathbone, and the reason why it's a great sword fight, not only because it's very suspenseful and dramatic and all the rest of it, but Tyrone Power and Basil Rathbone were arguably the two best fencers in Hollywood. So you actually get to see them, you know, whacking away each other with a great degree of skill. It's a very good sword fight, and it just takes place in a single room. So there's no spectacular backgrounds or any of the rest of it, but you don't need that with these two guys on screen. A movie actually called Swashbuckler, sometimes called The Scoundrel. It's called another name in France. It's a Belmondo movie, but it combines a swashbuckler with romantic comedy. And it's an excellent film. It's funny and exciting as well. And I love the plot line. Jean-Paul Belmondo is a guy who has to escape France as the French Revolution comes about. And he comes to the United States and he winds up in New Orleans, where he becomes engaged to the daughter of a wealthy plantation owner. But he can't marry her because he's already married in France. But then he learns that because of the French Revolution, divorce is now legal in France. France, once a very Catholic country, has fallen under the sway of atheistic um, you know revolutionaries. So he goes to return to France to divorce his wife and make himself single once again, and complications ensue. But there's lots of battle scenes and sword fighting and the rest of it. And Belmondo, does all of his own stunts, and he's a heck of a swordsman as well. Now, someone who wasn't a heck of a swordsman, but is famous for being a swordsman, was Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was not a very good fencer. Usually, his opponents, people like Basil Rathbone, uh, were there to make him look good. But you can't fault the guy. He looks like the absolute perfect picture of an iconic swashbuckling hero, and very athletic and the rest of it, but not particularly skilled at fencing. But despite that, Captain Blood is an awesome, awesome pirate movie. Another one with a Raphael Sabatini base for the screenplay. Um, he's also excellent in The Seahawks, very good pirate flick. And but probably my favorite pirate flick from that period is Tyrone Power and the Black Swan. It's got a terrific plot line, fantastic action, big budget. I think Fox production, and it is one of my favorites. And I neglected to mention Prisoner of Zenda. I should have mentioned that as well, which has a tremendous sword fight at the end. The original Prisoner of Zenda with Ronald Colman and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. The two of them go at it, and both of them were excellent fencers, and that's a heck of a fight as well. Okay. Hey, Bo Smith is checking in to ask me, do you carry a pocket knife? And if so, what kind? Well, you know what kind. The geekiest pocket knife I could find. Yes, I do carry this Steve Ditko Spider-Man pocket knife everywhere I go. And hey, everybody, it's a Bo Smith double spin. Another question from Bo. Bo says, what was the first comic book convention you ever went to? Well, it was the Phil Suling convention in New York, and I think Phil SulingCon was one of the first comic book conventions ever. I went there in 1971. I was just a young spud, still in high school, and my parents drove me. We lived outside Philadelphia. My parents drove me up to New York and dropped me off in front of the Statler Hilton Hotel. And this is the original con booklet, which I still have, and among other con booklets, because this was an annual thing for me from that point on, probably all the way up to like 1980. I went to this convention every single year as it got bigger and bigger and bigger, but still inside the hotel, and would eventually attend it as a professional, which was fun. Now, Phil Suling ran the con, and Phil Suling was kind of, before Stan Lee, Phil Suling was kind of the ambassador of comics. Uh, he would go out, and I can't remember. I can't remember a lot about Phil. A nice guy. Met him a whole bunch of times. He was very personable. He was hands-on at the con, and just a terrific guy. And here he is on the Mike Douglas show talking about comic books. And Mike's real interested. And yeah, he was spreading the word about comics and how popular they were becoming, as well as promoting his series of conventions. And you know, this is what the conventions would look like. Yeah, as I said, they all took place in a hotel. They would take over all the ballrooms, and look at this crowd, early '70s crowd. You know, how most of them are young guys, and some of them are wearing ties. How times have changed. No, they're not dressed as Boba Fett. they're dressed. They're dressed like they're going to church, or to grandma's house for Thanksgiving. And but this is what it was like. You know, it was just a bunch of fans getting together. It was a brotherhood, and for me, it wasn't a culture shock. It was a homecoming because I didn't really know anybody as into comics as I was until I got to this convention. I'd never met anybody who was excited about comics as I was. I mean, every kid read comics when I was a kid, but nobody was as geeked out about them as I was. And I got to go to these cons and buy stuff, just dealer tables full of stuff I'd never seen before. You know, back issue comics, original artwork, and in this age, there are a lot of bootleg comics, guys who would, you know, basically Xerox their comic books and bind them. So for a relatively small amount of money, I could read Golden Age comics I would never otherwise been able to afford. And just a heck of an experience that first day. I mean, just mind blown in probably the 5 or 6 hours I spent at the con that day. And one of the things I did was I went to attend the keynote address in the main ballroom, and the keynote address was delivered by Alex Toth, and it was a very memorable speech. Alex Toth was, you know, he was opinionated, wasn't afraid to tell you what was on his mind, and it was raucous and a lot of fun. And the thing is, like, it turns out I was sitting next to Al Williamson. The place was packed, standing room only. Uh, and I sat next to Al Williamson, who didn't look much older than me. He looked like a kid. He's there in his jeans and sneakers and t-shirt. And he started cutting up with Alex from the audience, and Alex, you know, identified him. And I'm like, holy crap, I'm sitting next to Al Williamson. Me, just some comic book fan from Philly. Just amazed me. It absolutely amazed me. The other guests that were there, Jim Steranko, looking young and studly, and Neil Adams, uh, Gil Kane. I mean, I didn't get to meet them. I just got to stare at them. And Roy G. Krenkel. Roy G. Krenkel, the great illustrator. I was going around the tables, the dealer tables, and here's this guy uh, with a briefcase. And he's opening the briefcase and he's showing the dealers this artwork he has in the briefcase. And there's all these little sketches and things like that in this briefcase. And he's trying to sell them to the dealers, you know, for cash. And I was like, wow, these are all by Roy G. Krenkel. I said, I love that guy's work. And he says, well, I am Roy G. Krenkel. Well, I'm blown away. You know, it's Roy G. Krenkel selling his own artwork table to table. Um, you know, and I'm like, I was speechless. I did, you know, I had a hard time speaking to people I idolized. I still do. And I mean, how cool was that? Actually, literally rubbing shoulders with a tremendous talent like that. And the celebrity guest at that con was Kirk Allen, the first guy ever to play Superman. So he was the celebrity guest. And one thing I learned was that the big thing amongst comic fans, because remember, I'd never been around comic fans before, and remember, this is 1971. The biggest interests were in Uncle Scrooge comics, Carl Barks fans, and EC comics. And I looked at some EC comics in back issues, and they were $5 a piece. Who would ever spend $5 on a comic book? I didn't bring any of them home, though in later years I would. I would eventually have, by visiting the New York Comic Con, a complete collection of Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales. But that day I was not spending my lawn mowing money on a comic book. $5. What are you, crazy? So anyway, yeah, it was an awesome experience. Absolutely mind-blowing. An unforgettable day. And I think my parents went and saw a Broadway show. So they enjoyed themselves too, spending the day in the Big Apple. Greg Halecki. Here's a more generic question about the Western genre in broad strokes, and you are clearly the guy to ask, Chuck. In movies set during or more often immediately after the Civil War, it seems to me that a greatly disproportionate number of the protagonists are ex-Confederates. Conversely, they are often opposed by some sort of representation of the Union. Do you think that it's obvious as just the romanticism of the forlorn and doomed hero clinging to the lost cause? Or do you think that it's something else? I think it's a number of things. And this is true. A lot of Westerns dealt with the aftermath of Civil War, or even during the Civil War, and the conflicts that still raged, before and after. And a lot of Westerns deal with this. And I think a lot of the reason is because it's rich turf to dig in. Because you get stuff like Veracruz, where you know former combatants in the Civil War travel on down to Mexico, including a lot of Confederates, in order to fight on one side or the other of the battles that were going on in Mexico when the Juaristas were trying to throw off the European overlords in the form of Emperor Maximilian. I mean, that's some rich turf to dig in. Major Dundee as well. A Union officer enlists the aid of Confederate prisoners of war to hunt down an Apache war chief across the Mexican border. I mean, wow, that stuff writes itself. I mean, how can you resist? And then you've got all those internal conflicts because these guys they hate each other. The wounds have not healed. So there's a lot there. And a lot of movies, Escape from Fort Bravo is another one. I mean, I could go on and on and on. The Confederate or ex-Confederate theme prevails through so many Westerns, right up to Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which takes place during the Civil War and deals a lot with the conflict. And, Clint Eastwood would revisit this in Outlaw Josie Wales, where he is a former Confederate guerrilla on the run in Texas with the Union Army on his tail. And, television as well. The television show The Rebel with Nick Adams as Johnny Yuma was a big success. I know my dad never missed an episode. And even recently, Hell on Wheels, the main protagonist is an unapologetic former slave owner and Confederate soldier. And so it's just a rich theme. I think one of the other reasons is probably commercial, because the idea of the noble, but as you said, forlorn Confederate soldier, basically the loser in our nation's greatest conflict, is a romantic figure. And also, the presentation of that figure appealed to Southern moviegoers and TV viewers. My dad was a Southerner. He read tons of Westerns and watched lots of TV Westerns. My father-in-law, another Southerner, read a lot of, the only work of mine he ever read was if I wrote a Western, he would read it. He loved Westerns as well. And I think generally, like, horror movies are the most popular in the Midwest. I think Westerns are more popular down south than they are in the rest of the country, even more popular than they are out west. So that's part of the reason. Part of it's commercial. Part of it is just the fertile ground that conflict provides to base Western stories on. So there you go. Ben Baker, do you think the latest mass layoffs at DC will clear the deadwood and allow the remaining staff to focus on making good comics again, or is the rot too deep there? Is this just the next step in them eventually shutting down monthly comics at DC? Well, I don't have any inside information, but I know a lot of the players, and some of those people were nice people. I wouldn't refer to them as deadwood, but then some of them were complete parasites and should have been cut out of the should have been cut out of the comic book metabolic system decades ago. Yeah, some of them should never have been welcomed in the first place. But they were definitely the problem, and definitely the reason why sales were shrinking, and DC's presence in popular culture was vanishing in the comic book realm, even as the characters remain popular in every other medium but comics. Um, and what does the future hold for them? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, Warner's mined them for the TV material, the movie material, but for the most part, I don't think Warner's paid a whole lot of attention to DC Comics itself until recently when they took a Warner's executive and put them in charge of it. She couldn't have been very happy about that. Shape this up. Well, whatever she did didn't work, and it didn't shape up, and the sales didn't increase. Now you've got AT&T running the show, and AT&T is $150 billion in debt. So I can't imagine they're real thrilled with hanging on to a subsidiary that doesn't really make them any money. And I mean on the publishing end. Obviously, on the licensing end, Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and all the rest, those are cash cows. They always make money. They always bring in the bread. But the comics themselves don't. And I can't imagine they're going to put up with it much longer. And I'm certain that the last two rounds of firings are directly related to the AT&T merger. So what's going to happen? I don't know. I mean, obviously, AT&T is going to keep DC Comics around as a licensing venture, but my suspicion is that will ultimately lead to them licensing out the comics characters themselves, much the same way that IDW is publishing a great degree of Marvel material that's licensed to them. I think DC Comics will begin licensing this stuff out. I know they're in chaos because I tried to contact people that I know and I'm still friendly with at DC, and um, just to see how things are going, just see how they are basically. And I'm hearing back very, you know, things sound dire. Things sound like Road Warrior up there. Like nobody knows what's going to happen next. So obviously, I have no idea what's going to happen next. I would love to see DC Comics continue on as a vital publishing venture. Comic books certainly need it, but it does kind of look like it's going to go away or take a different form as we go forward. Glenn Davis, who are your favorite singing cowboys? Well, I don't stray far. Roy Rogers. I mean, come on, King of the Cowboys. When I was a kid, Roy Rogers had his own show. Gabby Hayes had his own show. And, he was a good singer. Leonard Sly, Roy Rogers. He was a good singer, and his movies are fun. If you've never checked out a Roy Rogers movie, they're fun. My wife was stunned when I was away one time, and she was looking for something to show the kids, and she put on a Roy Rogers movie. And she said, wow, these things were really, really entertaining. And I said, yeah, that's why I have so many. They're not serious entertainment. Roy was not a great actor. Uh, someone asked Roy about acting one time, and how do you go about it? How do you approach character? And he says, well, if I'm playing the good guy, I smile all the time. And if I'm playing the bad guy, I don't. There you go. And not actually a cowboy. Marty Robbins is probably my favorite cowboy singer, particularly due to an album he did in the late 50s, early 60s of gunfighter ballads, taking advantage of the popularity of the TV Western, and taking advantage of the fact that he had a huge top 10 hit with the song El Paso. Marty recorded a whole album of gunfighting songs like Big Iron, and they're a lot of fun. Guy was a hell of a singer, hell of a musician, and I still listen to this album now and then. Good times. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another singing cowboy, which most of you probably never heard of. In the movie Evil Roy Slade, a comedy western, Dick Shawn just tears it up as Marshall Bing Bell, a a singing lawman who his music has more to do with Las Vegas than it does with anything Western, but it's a terrific performance, as every Dick Shawn performance is. It's unique. If you ever get a chance to watch it, Evil Roy Slade with John Astin playing a legendary Western outlaw. It predates Blazing Saddles, but is one of the best Western parodies ever. Toe Cutter 5000. Boy, I'd love to have an explanation for that name. You've, you, I mean, are you a podiatrist? Um, you've previously mentioned being inspired by Hong Kong film when writing the action your books during the 90s. I find it especially evident in the first Robin miniseries. It seems they greatly impacted entertainment culture in the 90s and early 2000s with stuff like The Matrix and Reservoir Dogs. Sadly, it seems they've lost their influence over the past 10 years. Did you like watching HK movies in general? If so, what are some of your favorites? Yeah, I mean, I got into Hong Kong movies in a big way. I can't tell you how many stores in Chinatown in New York I got thrown out of trying to buy Laserdiscs. I didn't understand the language, and one store owner actually chased me out of the store, uh, uh, saying, "These are not for you. These are not for you." But I did. But there was a great market in bootleg videotapes. And I would get these little Xerox catalogs in the mail. And so I was able to catch up with a lot of terrific films. My absolute favorite from that period is a film called Burning Paradise, and it's sometimes called The Rape of the Red Lotus Temple. And it is a wild movie about Fang Sai-yuk, who is a legendary real life martial arts character. And in this movie, directed by Ringo Lam, terrific, his only martial arts film. Ringo Lam is a great Hong Kong director, and this is his only martial arts flick. And it's about the hero ends up in this subterranean city or temple uh, where they do human sacrifices, and it's ruled over by a bunch of sadistic Satan worshiping monks. I mean, it is a wild and crazy movie, and the martial arts in it are terrific and mostly done without wires. And the sets are fantastic, and it's kind of it's an excellent mishmash of kung fu and a horror film, and the action is fantastic. And I've watched it many times. Kind of wish Lam had done more martial arts films. He mostly does cop dramas, which are also excellent. Another favorite of mine is In the Line of Fire 3. This was a series where Cynthia Khan plays a Hong Kong policewoman, but this is the best of them all. She's up against two really insane, psychotic criminals, a man and a woman, and the action is fast and furious. And I think I borrowed this scene a couple of times where she gets in a dust up with some guys and she tears her skirt so she can do those spin kicks more readily. She tears her uniform skirt. But Cynthia Khan is just a terrific martial artist and a terrific actress. And but this is my favorite of all the films that she was in. Another Ringo Lam film makes my list. It's called Full Contact. Chow Yun Fat is a motorcycle riding badass. He's a criminal, and he might have been an undercover cop. It's been a while since I watched this movie, but he's up against some really skeevy bad guys and girls, and there's terrific gun battles and fights and all the rest of it, including a memorable fight inside of an ice house. I remember watching this. I managed to get a Hong Kong Laserdisc of this. The beauty of Hong Kong Laserdiscs were they all had English subtitles because they were still under the rule of Great Britain, and by law, um, every movie had to have English subtitles so that English people could watch them. And anyway, I remember watching this on Laserdisc and then taking it the next day over to Flint Henry's house and making him sit down and watch it because I thought it was so awesome. And he thought it was awesome too. So another great one is The Legend of Wise Lee. Wise Lee is a hero in apparently hundreds of novels in China. He's a cultural icon in China, and he investigates the supernatural. Think of a kung fu hero combined with kind of an X-Files kind of plot line. And I won't reveal the surprise ending of this movie, but it's nuts, it's wild, it's gonzo. But he's always played by different actors. And the thing is, this is the only Wise Lee movie that I started watching and knew it was a Wise Lee movie. I watched a bunch of others, and I'm 5 minutes into the film before this is a Wise Lee movie. And he always dealt with supernatural science fiction elements, geomancy, sorcery, stuff like that, and always wild and crazy. And there's a fight inside of a glacial cave that's quite astounding in this movie. Um, Also, there's a chase across rooftops in Tibet, in a village high up in the Himalayas, that's absolutely awesome. And a car chase, a couple of good car chases, which is unusual. Asian films, I'm always underwhelmed by their car chases, but this movie had a couple of goodies. Um, Here's an oddity most of you have probably never heard of. It's a movie called A Swordsman in Double Flag Town. It takes place in way up there in Mongolia, and it's the closest thing to a spaghetti western I've ever seen in a Hong Kong sword movie genre. And it's a goodie. It's a goodie. It was obviously shot on a low budget, but that kind of helps it. And it's set in, the most bleak, barren landscape you could possibly imagine, out there on the Mongolian steppe, and with a city that's nestled in amongst the most unusual natural rock formation I've ever seen. And I'm amazed that they don't use it in movies more often. But it's a good one. It's a bit of a slow burn, but it is a good one. Ben Baker again, a Ben Baker double spin. When adapting something for comics or other mediums, how important is it to stick what originally happened versus keeping with the same theme and style, but changing or reordering events to fit the new medium? Um, well, when I adapt stuff, generally I'm an invisible hand writer, but when I adapt stuff, I'm really invisible hand. I don't want to insert myself at all in the original material. I'm basically what I'm doing is I'm you know doing my party trick of changing prose into graphic novel form, into comic form, and my other job is basically just add value to the original material. My most successful adaptation I've ever done and most successful project I've ever worked on from a sales point of view is The Hobbit. Continues to be a bestseller around the world. Um, and, you know, I didn't use any dialogue that Tolkien didn't write. I didn't. My first approach was to basically make a Disney movie out of it, and I wasn't happy with that, and no one else was. So I just went to a strict, straight up adaptation, and stuck to what Tolkien wrote and nothing else. And of course, things had to be dropped because of the length of the comic project. Things had to be cut. I had to cut my favorite character, Bjorn, entirely out of the story, and just stick to the story of Bilbo Baggins, focus entirely on him. And and a lot of times when when I'm adapting a longer piece into a restricted amount of comic book pages, that's what I have to do. Basically, I have to pick a character and follow them, and concentrate on that because there's simply no real estate for adapting the entire novel, unless I'm given lots of room, as I was in The Forgotten Man. The Forgotten Man is a graphic novel version of Amity Shley's classic History of the Great Depression, as illustrated by Paul Ravoche. And it's a thick book. It is well over 200 pages. And this was difficult material because it's real facts. And a lot of it is dry. Not when you read Amity's work, but it would be dry to retell it in a comic. Uh, for a history of the Great Depression, Amity wrote a page turner. It reads like a thriller, and there's heroes and villains and everything else you need for a comic book, but so much of it dealt with economics, that it had to be translated into comics form in a new and interesting way. And luckily, we had Paul Ravoche as an artist. Paul is so versatile that he could draw in a 1930s cartooning style when we needed it, and then of course draw in a more realistic style, and he could draw hats. That was the when Amity said, "Who would you want on this project?" I said, "Well, my first person I would pick is Paul Revouche, a Canadian artist. And she said, why? And I said, because he can draw hats. And that's the most important thing about this book. That's going to be the most important visual of this book, is that all the men wear hats. And as you can see, Paul draws the hell out of them. And but the thing is, as we got into the project, we learned that Paul was good at everything we needed for this book, and also he was in line with the thinking of this book, the philosophy of this book. And but it was a difficult adaptation. I probably spent more time with the author on this than I've ever spent with any other author I've adapted, because Amity wanted to be very much involved with it. And in the end, she learned how to write comics as well as prose. She got a crash course in the graphic novel medium. Now, on the flip side, I did another nonfiction book, Clinton Cash, and Peter Schweitzer gave me free rein. This is another book that's difficult to turn into comics because it deals with backroom deals and economics and a massive con game being pulled. And there's lots of scenes in it of people getting in and out of cars and meeting in offices and traveling in jets, and none of it was very visually exciting. What I presented to Peter, and I wrote 5 sample pages to show him what I was talking about, was to do a sort of National Lampoon approach to it. Now, National Lampoon was a satire magazine, much like Mad Magazine, and they did a lot of comic satires. But the difference between National Lampoon's comic satires and Mad's were that National Lampoon's comic satires were drawn straight and written funny. So you would look at them and they'd be drawn by Neil Adams or Bernie Wrightson or somebody like that, or Gray Morrow, Frank Springer, and Russ Heath, and they would look like regular comic books until you read them, and then they were hysterically funny. So they would be parodying the material, and they'd be parodying comics at the same time. I said, that's the approach I want to take. So I wrote these 5 pages. Peter read them. He says, I love it. I love it. Go crazy. Do it this way. Go crazy. And he just gave us carte blanche to go nuts. And I like the finished product because it tells the Clinton Cash story more clearly, and Peter even said this, more clearly than the book did or the documentary did. We lay out the machinations of the Clinton Foundation and all of their many friends around the world. They're wealthy friends. They're wealthy, corrupt, despotic friends around the world. We lay it out very, very clearly for the reader so you can understand exactly what was going on here, what the cabal was all about, and what they were trying to accomplish. And, I like that it did that. I like that it's funny. And I also liked it. It's kind of a satire on comics, the way the National Lampoon stuff was. So it worked all the way around, in my opinion. But it was another difficult adaptation. This was not easy. This was a bit of a slog. And then, of course, it had to be run through banks and banks of lawyers. But to get back to your original question, I wanted to stay with what Peter wrote. And I did. I stayed loyal to what he wrote. I simply illuminated what was in the original book. Now, currently, I'm adapting the first book in John Ringo's Black Tide Rising series. It's a zombie apocalypse series. And this was a crowdfunding project. And I'm doing the first graphic novel, which will do the first half of the first book, a 64-page graphic novel. And the difficulty here is the amount of material. It's a thick book, and I don't have a lot of comic book real estate. And there's a lot of scientific stuff to be explained. And that can be deadly on a comic page. While it's totally engrossing when read in prose, it's dead on the comic book page. And the exact same material just sort of seems tedious when you attach pictures to it. So my job is to make that more visually interesting. And as in The Hobbit, I sort of have to zero in on the characters that I want to portray. What's important? Where's the spine of the story? And the spine of the story in this one is the Smith family, husband and wife and their 2 teenage daughters. And that's what I had to concentrate on for the graphic novel. The novels range a little bit away from them, but off into other territory because, this was the beginning of a series of books with a huge ensemble. But for the first book, I had to concentrate on that smaller cast. And again, keeping what John wrote, not varying from his dialogue unless I have to for panel segues or whatever. Mostly, this was a job of going in and cutting away what was not needed for a faithful comic book adaptation. So, so there you go. That's it for this week. A little inside writing, a little bit of movie favorites. Keep those questions coming. And if you would, if you know another geek like yourself, like me, that would love to hear some inside baseball about comics, why not tell them? They might be glad to know. Let them know about this channel. Uh, Let them know that maybe they've got questions they want answered. I'm certainly anxious to answer them. So just put the word out for me there so we can keep this whole thing going. Because if you enjoy these videos, and I enjoy them, and you want to see more of them weekly, uh, you know, I need eyes. I need listeners. I need viewers to make this worth doing. I got to grow the audience for this. So you can help. Share on social media, email, down at the local comic shop, whatever. Get these videos in front of the face of all of your geeky friends, all the comic book fans and let's keep this going. All right, everybody. I will see you all down the road.